Yan!
Yun.
Episode 20! Very special day. We have very special guests. Thank you very much everyone for joining us again. So medyo marami tayong episodes, marami tayong nakausap. And but let me just say, proud din ako na meron tayong balance on many levels, including gender balance. So we have had LGBT, we have had women, we have had Lord De Vera, we have had men, right? And today we have, of course, Cecilia Lero, a very good friend of ours throughout the days. So we have a very smart academic today, an activist, and of course, most importantly, right, a very progressive person who can shed light on latest issues in the country. So, sorry, medyo nadidistract ako sa kanya kasi ang fresh ng morning niya tayo, mukha tayong waragi.
Kasi dito eh.
This is so unfair.
What time is it there ngayon? What time is it there right now?
10:30 a.m.
Oh my God. So, I thought
tapos
kasi
ano sinabi ni Richard? What did he say? Parang nausap ng 1 hour?
Start? 9:30.
Ay, yung pala Richard. Ano ba yan?
But I thought 9:30 p.m. sa atin, it's like 9:30 there. Parang I was thinking like DC, New York pala. So Sao Paulo ka, di ba? So Sao Paulo is
it's one more time zone. No, it's one more time zone.
Kasi banking ng konting continent, di ba? Yeah, okay, all right. It's not very parallel. Thank you very much for that. So I had to fix my topography. I was supposed to be in Brazil, but things happen. Hopefully we can get there. Thank you so much, Cecilia, for joining us today. Mark, right? Do you have any questions before I go into things? Kasi mamaya mabash na naman ako to si Richard na naman eh. Ano, Mark, do you have to
Sir, kamusta na dyan? How are things there in Brazil?
Sao Paulo, right?
Sao Paulo is the biggest city of Brazil. As of this month, November, everything's open. So things are coming back, parties are coming back. Vaccination is expected to be finished in this state by this month. So it's still not super great. There's a lot of hunger, a lot of economic crisis, healthcare crisis, of course, but a lot better than where we were last year.
Right. Sounds familiar. Sounds very home. Sounds very familiar. So on that note, actually, Cecilia, we want to start with your background because yan ang ginagawa namin sa mga guests namin. Of course, celebrity or academic or whatever you are, we want people to know better about you beyond the usual stuff that are known about you. So, of course, our introduction for you is that you're an academic postdoctoral fellow based in University of Sao Paulo, right, which is the leading university. This is the Federal State University, parang UP, no? The Liman version, I suppose.
State University, Federal.
Right.
The leading.
It's the leading university in Brazil, right? And of course, Brazil is one of the most exciting countries out there, and it's very similar to the Philippines, right? But before we go to Brazil, right, before we make this even more exotic than it is, I want to know a little bit more about you because I think we met. No, sorry, Mark. Wag kang ma-OP, Mark. Eventually, you'll be friends with our guest. Don't worry. Kasi yung ating complaint niya at mamaya si Mark sabihin na ito na mga insider stories. No, but honestly, we met each other, if I'm not mistaken, 2009 in a rally, I think PNoy rally or something like that. Now, of course, this doesn't mean we're partisan or anything like that, but that was the time I saw you, and I think you were kind of in yellowish or something like that. So my image of you was like, oh, the yellow girl or something like that. Sorry, don't kill me. But this was really, I think that's the only time we really kind of met you, and then we didn't have much of a conversation throughout the year. So thank you very much for responding to our request to have us here. So if I'm not mistaken, you work in the Philippine government during the PNoy time, right? But
no, I did not work in the government.
But you were based in the Philippines during the PNoy time. So can you tell us more about your background before I embarrass myself more? So you're originally a New Yorker, right?
I grew up in New York.
Right.
I came back to the Philippines and started working in NGOs after college, so a long time ago. Tapos, I'm a member of Akbayan, which at that time was a coalition member with the PNoy campaign and later the PNoy government. So I was involved in the campaign, but during the PNoy years, I went back to graduate school. I was doing mostly, when I came back to the Philippines, I would come back and do mostly NGO work. I was not working in government. Then later on, I worked in the Senate for a non-LP investigation.
That's what I mean, right? Yeah, you work with certain policymakers. That's what I mean, not necessarily in the executive branch, right? Yeah.
Yes, pero not LP, not necessarily LP policymakers. Tapos, I was also working in the House under Congressman Tom Villarin of Akbayan.
Right.
And yun, I came to Brazil at the end of 2017 after Digong became president for many reasons.
Right.
Primarily because of Digong.
But did you go back to the US first? Were you there during Trump era? Because
No, just for visiting, just for working, but not. I never lived in the US during the Trump era, but I was there a lot.
Right. So you kind of escaped from Duterte, skipped Trump, then ended up in Brazil, which fell under Bolsonaro. That's quite an interesting event, I would say. Maybe you're the reason this is happening, right? Which other
alam mo, when Bolsonaro was elected, I said I pulled on all my training as a social scientist to remind myself that correlation is not causation.
Please don't come back to the Philippines until patapos ng elections because I know who's gonna win.
No, don't say that.
I'll see you after elections, hopefully. Or we'll visit you after Bolsonaro, maybe hopefully new president next year. So now I perfectly can understand what's going on, why this wave up, and apparently it coincides. No, very strong correlation, but definitely not causation. But by the way, can you a little bit give us a background about this? Because in the previous episode, di ba Mark, pinag-usapan natin sila Calyodi at saka si Doc Walden Bello, and we try to differentiate them from yung mga Makabayan bloc, etc. So I know many Filipinos are not familiar with this. I was not familiar with this until I worked with Walden Bello for a while, and I worked in the Congress. So disclosure also, of course, about my own background. So I heard about this reaffirmists, rejectionists, etc. So, you know, this, but of course I said in UP, so dapat I know a thing or two, right? But you coming from the US, how did you end up with the Akbayan group? What was with the Akbayan group and, you know, with their ideology and advocacies that attracted you and hopefully continues to attract you perhaps in one way or another? And what were the observations you had? Because later on we'll discuss your research. You had a lot of research about the deficiencies and limitations na fine-face ng mga liberal, reformist, center-left governments in places like Brazil, Philippines, US, among others, right? But before that, how did you get involved with Akbayan, among others? Don't worry, I don't think you're going to be red tagged. No, I don't think some parlad is watching us or something like that. But go ahead, yeah.
At saka, Professor Walden is a often co-author of mine. We work together a lot. I respect him a lot. So when I first came to the Philippines as an adult, in my adult years, I worked at an NGO called the Institute for Popular Democracy, which had where the mission of the NGO was to take research and really make it applicable in the real world. Hindi yung research for research sake, kundi yung research to actually change people's lives and inform policy based on science and not just chamba, which unfortunately is what happens a lot. So at that time, I was exposed to a lot of people from the Democratic left. So these are groups like Akbayan, like Partido Lakas ng Masa, which I know Calyodi and Walden represent now, which at that time was Laban ng Masa.
Which is not Makabayan bloc, right? Because Mark was also
not Makabayan bloc. The biggest difference, as it was explained to me, is that the Makabayan bloc believes that they are the vanguard, the left, the progressive group, and walang space for other progressive groups.
Kami lang talaga. Siya na.
Which is a classic Leninist approach.
Marxist, Leninist, Maoist, Stalinist, right? That
That there can only be one. Whereas in the democratic left, what we call ourselves the democratic left, I still want progressivism. We still want to break up monopolies of power, to democratize beyond the system we have of local elites and basically hacienderos and old families and big business people that run things. But we also believe in plurality. We don't believe that there can only be one party that runs things. Because even if you put me as someone who makes all the decisions, I'm going to mess up. I need someone to debate me, to challenge me. Kaya siguro mas magulo kami kasi there's not just one party line. But we believe in we don't necessarily believe in pure capitalism, but we also
Right.
but we do believe in the marketplace of ideas, no? That good faith conversation, good faith debate is better than having a single party line that cannot be questioned.
So kind of liberal leftish in a sense, like inclusive, pluralistic, but still with progressive socioeconomic agenda. I mean, is Bernie Sanders, for instance, a kind of a counterpart? Can people think about kind of a more famous global icons? Is Alexandria
Sure.
Cortez kind of also in that the same mix, right? Democratic left, something like that. I mean, just for readers, or I'm sorry, audience who are not very familiar about all of this left, because when you say left, lahat yan komunista, right? Yeah, yan ang talagang tingin na, di ba? But it's actually 50 shades of gray or 1,000 shades of gray, in for that matter.
Oo, ang dami talagang definition ng left. Pero I think Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez is a good example.
Right.
Bernie is probably a good example too. Yung what's important is that kasi mag-ingat tayo sa yung salitang liberal, kasi liberal is also a very loaded word, no?
Especially in Philippines
Liberal.
now, right?
Oo. So, karamihan ng tao, akala nila liberal is dilawan. Ano ba yung dilawan? Hindi rin nila alam, no? What does that even mean? They think it's
I think
associated.
Liberal Party, yung talagang inisip LT machinery. Yung,
Oo, pero ano ba yung LP?
Right.
They think it's personalities. Kasi our politics, unfortunately, is so personality-based. Pero when we use terms like liberal as people who study, as political scientists, as people who want to be exact with our terms,
Right.
meron yung sense of liberal democracy na yun, pluralistic, civil liberties, pero meron din yung liberal in the economic sense, which is the government does not interfere, which is
free market.
Which is not what I am for.
Right.
In social liberal din, di ba? Parang
yeah, tanong mo yun kasi Mark, di ba, you were also asking me about this because I said I am a liberal but not a liberal party liberal, right? I believe in political liberalism, meaning pluralism, hindi lang ako tama. I accept that there are diversity of views. To a certain degree, I believe that government should not control everything, but I still believe in a certain degree of social democratic, commanding heights kind of economy. So this is very different from liberal party, which I think is really more like just free market. It's really about free market, private property, etc. So I think if you want to find an American counterpart, hindi Democratic Party, it's more Republican, traditional, Hillary Clinton kind of faction. Again, it's very hard, but I just want to explain because in the Philippines, Liberal Party, Aquino's, Marojas, essentially that is the representation of liberal politics sa imahinasyon ng yung ordinaryong Pilipino, no? I would say even in political discourse. 'Di ba Mark? I mean, 'di ba ganun 'yun pag sinabi yung liberal?
Baka liberal by name na lang eh. Filipinos ka don't understand the word exactly din eh. Just think lang liberal Aquino ka or liberal Marojas ka. So ganun lang yung understanding.
I agree with Mark. Parang yun ang point ko kasi at the end of the day, parties in the Philippines, bukod sa mga parties katulad ng Akbayan, ng Partido Lakas ng Masa, even the Makabayan Bloc, parties don't really have an ideology package per se. You know, think about another great political scientist that a lot of us respect, Nathan Kimpo. I think it was him who wrote political parties in the Philippines are rotating fan clubs of whoever is the candidate at the moment. So, kahit sasabihin mo sa mga tao na or kahit people think that liberals Aquino or liberals Rojas, they don't really know what that means in terms of economic policy or in terms of social policy. They just think of, is this candidate honest? Is this candidate good? And I really wish that people, I mean, of course, it's an important metric that people base who they support on what they perceive to be the integrity of the candidate. Pero sana they also look at actual policies because at the end of the day, a lot of the politicians who do bad stuff think they're doing something good for the country. They've convinced themselves of that. Us who have worked in politics know this. So saying, this person loves the country, they all love the country, but which section are they defending more than others?
So I think in psychology, there's a term hypocriticism. So if there's hypercriticism, you're very self-critical. Politicians tend to become hypo. So they're not very critical of themselves. They automatically assume they are the interests of the public. So parang swerte kayo, pinaanak kayo sa panahon ko. Parang ganun, no? I mean, you could say a lot of people get overwhelmed by that, no? But Cecilia, I wanted to ask you, so based on your experience, nung time na nasa Pilipinas ka, somewhere circa 2010 to 2015, 16, etc., anong mga basic impressions and overall, as a social scientist, as a political scientist, ano yung mga general extrapolations na nakuha mo dun sa nature of political contestation in the Philippines? For instance, kamusta yung mga left natin? Kamusta yung political parties natin? Kamusta yung reform agenda and democracy in the Philippines? And the reason I'm asking you, Cecilia, is because you're not just familiar with one developing country versus America, right? Because you're also familiar with another developing country, which is Brazil, which we'll discuss later on. Because I always say, if you only know one country, you know no country. It's only in comparative perspective, especially between two similar countries, that you get to know things. In my case, of course, I'm very familiar with Turkey, with Middle Eastern countries, etc. So I use that as a reference to understand also what's happening on the other. So when you know multiple developing countries, malalaman mo hindi tayo masyadong unique. Yung mga kalokohan natin, mga Pinoy, good luck, punta ka sa India, tingnan mo yung traffic nila doon, di ba? Or yung mga bola-bola kalokohan. I mean, so I think that's why hindi yung mga walang ganyan sa States. So the reason, of course, Cecilia, you're going to be very instructive in your analysis because you're also familiar with other developing countries and besieged democracies like Brazil. But first of all, balik tayo doon sa Pilipinas without using a Western first world standard. Ano yung mga findings mo, if I could use that term as a social scientist, but on a personal, emotional level, putting aside academics and jargons, ano yung mga na-feel mo sa Pilipina? Because they say always Filipino, very emotional type, personalistic. But I would say, well, guess what? Boris Johnson did not become the prime minister because he was a policy guy, because, just people liked him. So personality politics matters in the US, in UK, right? Not only there. And Latin America, my God, they're even more emotional than us, I could say. Or Italians, right? Even though they're EU, Italians are the most emotional people you can say, at least in the Western world. So what are your takes now? You think we have to really reflect upon? Because just to be honest, sorry, I'm talking a lot about this because I want to emphasize gaano kamahalaga ito, because Mark has been asking me this. We have been asking, bakit lumalakas itong authoritarian nostalgia? Bakit Duterte, now Marcos? So we want to understand what went right, what went wrong, and what are the things we have to do in the future, hopefully. That's why I think your view would be very essential. Yes, Cecilia.
So, totoo yun. Yung palagi sinasabi ng Pinoy na only in the Philippines nangyayari itong bad thing. Brazilians say the same thing, It's unfair of us to be so pejorative towards ourselves. Right. General impressions. At tamo nung time na yun, my big push of hope, Everybody remembers all this goodwill of the Pinoy government. Ako as an individual, I was more parang calm. Parang hindi pa nanalo yung revolution.
Excited masyado, yeah. Chill lang.
Oo, chill lang. Kasi I view that period as a transition period from the 10, almost 11 years of Gloria, when there was a lot of institutional decay, to a transition to something with stronger institutions na more inclusive economically and socially. Pero yung observations namin from knowing lots of people in government, from knowing lots of people who interacted with government, kasi at that was the time also when government, yung inner workings opened up to civil society. May chance kami to see inside, kaya hindi kami kasali. Na talagang it's a big, slow-moving, very corrupt machine with a lot of syndicates in the branches, in the executive agencies.
The ruling coalition in general, in ruling coalition. Yeah.
Na kahit may a lot of goodwill, pero in the bureaucracy itself. So even if you change out all the secretary still has to deal with the textbook syndicate. Marami na akong enemies. The textbook syndicate, the bus syndicate.
Wag ka muna umuwi. Elections ka talaga eh. I'm sorry, this podcast is kind of like that. Medyo slippery. Sige, go. Farmali. Okay, farmali. Ano pa?
So, it was a time of a lot of hope, but also a lot of parang trying to understand how parang the first time we got to look at this big machine and then trying to grapple with how to deal with it as people in civil society and as a junior coalition partner that basically had one foot in the government and one foot out. Right. Tapos kasama din yung how do we deal with this? Kasi we came from, especially how I quote unquote grew up in activism in the Philippines. I got my chops during GMA's time. So talagang opposition kami. Talagang every 2 weeks there's a big scandal, no? Which by today's standards seems like mabagal yung
boring yung GMA days.
Medyo.
Oh my God. Yeah, you were saying, thanks for reminding, kasi tayo medyo mas matanda tayong millennial. Sorry for saying that, because I think there are a lot of people who forget that there was an Arroyo era.
Wala pa masyadong social media.
PNoy na lang and Duterte, right?
That's a really good point, Mark, kasi I was thinking about that as I was brushing my teeth this morning. Parang a lot of people forget about the GMA times. Parang sinasabi nila na, after Marcos Aquino ruined everything, hello, there's lots of years between Marcos and the second Aquino, and lots of really bad years. So, yun. So it was a big challenge also to go from opposition to actually having a chance to
kind of administration,
be
right?
part of it.
Yeah.
But not with a lot of power, but still trying to maximize your space inside to make reforms. But it was a time of, yun nga, a lot of hope, a lot of frustration. Pero parang kaya pala natin, we're on the right track. Right. At the same time, you see the frustration. Parang naiintindihan ko naman yung frustration ng mga tao na, it seemed like such a glowy, wonderful time, pero mahirap pa rin yung tao. Poverty rate did not drop so much. And I think that's really a setback, already taking a leap into the comparative side of a lot of these countries that went through or started their democratic transitions in the 80s, is that kasi there's a big worldwide pressure since the 80s and 90s, pressure coming from the West, coming from developed countries.
Third wave democracy, right? Third wave.
Oh, third wave democracies. There's a lot of pressure in the late 80s and 90s, the Washington Consensus, the New Reaganomics and everything, for us as developing countries to have liberal economic policies, to have economic policies where the government does not insert itself so much and you just let the big businesses go.
Oligarchs.
Yeah. So, and the nature of that is that there will be lots of inequality. There will be lots of the dismantling of labor rights, contractualization, and yun nangyari na the PNoy government,
right,
tried to implement some social policies to deal with extreme poverty. We always argued it should have been more, but it was better than it was.
Unconditional cash transfer, that's what you're referring to?
For peace.
Which came from...
Pero I mean,
Brazil,
Walden
right?
had a really good article at that time na CCT should be part of a holistic anti-poverty solution, right, not just a single program. And yeah, that came from Brazil, but
Bolsa
the
Familia.
CCT called here Bolsa Familia was also part of hugely expanding the federal university program,
right,
expanding, putting racial quotas for the universities, because for who doesn't know, Brazil is a country that's actually 50% Afro-descendant.
Right.
It's the last country in the Western Hemisphere to abolish slavery, and those inequalities still exist. At the same time, yun din yung criticism from a lot of academics here na there were a lot of social policies, a lot of social inclusion policies, pero yung dismantling of the exploitative nature of the capitalist state, din nangyari.
Yeah. Cecilia, can I ask? Sorry, Mark, if you want to ask on this, because I mean, I remember the first times I saw PNoy, my impression of him was he was very funny, he was very entertaining. I remember also in first speeches in Maros. This is like 2009, 2010, etc. He was a bit stiff, etc. But I don't know. I mean, maybe I was just naive back then, but for me, like, mukhang this guys had the good intentions. I mean, you didn't get this sense na super trapo tong mga to na they're just another politicians to choose out and milk out the country. I don't know. I mean, this was my impression back then. Of course, I'm a very different person now. But ikaw, coming from abroad, coming from New York, it's not like New York is a bastion of good governance itself, right? I mean, it's a messy, messy place. May pagka Manila din eh. Kind of first world Manila version. But what was your impression of PNoy, of Maros, of these people in positions of power when this transitional situation was happening when you were in the Philippines back in the days?
I mean, yeah, I saw them. I had a similar impression that there are
Mhm.
people who basically wanted to do good. They're not super power hungry. They're not looking to be in office just to protect their personal businesses, which a lot of politicians are there for that. Eh, pero they don't come from a progressive tradition. They don't have an ideology na, this is the holistic, my vision for transforming the state into a state that
Right, right.
that has strong institutions that works for the people, you know. My impression at that time, and I could be wrong, dami pa rin akong friends na very close to them, so sorry, sorry in advance.
This is why
Pero
we have this podcast. Yeah, go ahead. Say sorry, but say it. Yeah.
my impression is that, yun nga, it was about reformism, about reducing corruption, about making things more efficient, pero a vision for transformation, medyo kulang pa.
Ikaw, Mark, di ba may sinabi ka about that na parang, parang back in the days, medyo magaan ang feeling mo about this Aquinos and all of that. Pero parang may kapos, di ba? Parang something like that. You were saying something like that in our discussions, di ba, Mark? Yung impressions mo of the, of the Aquinos, etc. I mean, ikaw, Mark, sa tingin mo, ano yung kulang sa mga, I'm sorry, sa Aquinos, right? I mean, hindi siya corrupt as a person. I mean, we know that, right? Hindi sila mamamatay tao, right? So they clear some of the, they tick some of the boxes, right? But
I think he was too slow on yung mga yung dun sa PPP sa
right, public-private partnership infrastructure.
Ang daming mga infrastructure projects ang na-delay and siguro that's what Duterte capitalized on dun sa kanyang 6 years, yung mga hindi natapos. So I think doon sa part na yon. Tapos PNoy said din na na they were not too good in communicating yung mga achievements niya. Parang
wala siyang troll farm as much, is that what you're saying? Wala siyang vloggers. Let's just spell it out because
this was pre-2016 So 2016 naman talaga sumabog yung lahat ng So they didn't expect siguro a world that will be dominated by troll farms and pages and
tingin mo, Mark, naive sila? You think they were naive? They were like, why do you think they didn't anticipate it? I mean, this is politics, ruthless yan. I mean, you're a vlogger yourself.
No one did in 2016. I think
only but the Marcoses have been that, right? I mean, the Marcoses have been active. We discussed this with Lelo, right? Yung mga Yellow Monkey, all of those stuff. 2012 pa lang lumalabas yan. Cecilia, you want to tell us something about this? Because I remember we had some discussion the other year about you were already having a hunch of this storm to come, right? Yung mga fake surveys, yung mga online text, yung mga troll farms. We don't need names, but you told me something that alam mo na dati pa na may ganun na parating that the storm was coming.
First, let me qualify na what I said earlier, parang they wanted to just clean up corruption and make things
please go ahead.
Parang that's not, it's easy to say it now, that's not really transformative, but it's kind of a big deal.
After Arroyo. Let's not forget. This is after Arroyo.
Pero going to what you're saying, I remember 2009 pa lang, I was at a press conference with our then senatorial candidate, Risa, who's now running again. Super endorsement. And in the room next to us, someone else was having a press conference saying that actually Cory and PNoy were cousins, and that's why Joshua came out the way he did.
Oh wow!
As in,
that's
well funded. I will not say who it was, but it was a well-known media personality saying that, and the reporters actually came to our room to say, "Grabe, hindi ko kaya, hindi ko masikmura doon."
Grabe. Wow.
So at that early 2009,
we
we're all
area that place, diba? This is that.
It was in Quezon City in the Morato area.
Okay, yeah.
At a very nice restaurant there. So as early as 2009, we were already seeing these well-produced.
Tulfo yan, no? Hindi Tulfo. Sorry. Hindi Tulfo yan, no? Favorite ni Mark yan, si Tulfo. Hindi ba si Tulfo yan?
Hindi. It wasn't Tulfo.
I'm just kidding. Going back. Naghanap lang ako ng trolls Sige, atake tayo. Go. Sorry, Mark.
So that early 2009, we were already seeing these well-produced animations popping up on YouTube, the truth about the EDS revolution, the golden age of the Philippines. Na coincidental or not coincidentally, probably by design, is another thing that defenders of the dictatorship here in Brazil are using to refer to the era of dictatorship as well.
Yeah, interesting.
So,
Because speaking of the third wave, Philippines and Brazil kind of transitioned back to democracy, more or less back to back. 1988 ba ang Brazil or 1987? Something like that, right? Ang transition niyo back to democracy. 1986 ang Philippines, then South Korea, then Argentina, then Brazil, right? So more or less late 1980s, no? And I think Brazil had even more brutal, no? Yung martial law, talagang generals in charge. Hindi like walang Marcos, talagang generals talaga. No? Can you tell us about the similarities with Brazil? Because I think that might inform also our understanding of situations and comparison.
generals talaga, pero there was more. Just looking at the recorded numbers, there were more killings and more disappearances in the Philippine martial law than in the Brazilian martial law.
Really? Oh,
yeah.
I thought it's the opposite. Oh, wow. Okay. I mean, the Argentina, di ba? The desaparecidos, right? That's well known, right?
Ang daming disappeared sa Argentina. Meron din naman sa Brazil at maraming torture sa Brazil. Maraming torture. Pero yung actual recorded killings, my understanding it's just less in Brazil.
Worse in the Philippines, even though it was not a military dictatorship. It was okay. Well, that's. I always thought Brazil was even worse than the Philippines. The other thing I remember is that in Brazil, they actually had some few years at least of very good industrialization and economic growth, even during their martial law and general years. The time of general, right? I mean, for a while the economy was not doing too bad, right?
Yeah, I mean, the same as the early Marcos years, same as the early Pinochet years, because you have a centralized government that is spending a lot on big ticket infrastructure projects. So you're creating an economic bubble, right? We know, classic Keynesianism, economic theory, you spend a lot, you stimulate the economy, and so you have GDP growth. That's why in the Philippines, our GDP always has a spike in election years kasi dami ng buhay.
Alam mo na yan, Mark. Just busy na next year yan. Yeah.
Pero similar to the Philippines, that can't last forever because first of all, you're creating a lot of social strife because you're forcibly moving people from one place or another without adequate social programs. Why do we have huge slums in Manila? Why do we have huge slums in the cities in Brazil? Kasi you have a kind of rapid urbanization incentivized by the government, but without creation of housing or sewage or water. Tapos it's a bubble that's not sustainable. Tapos kinurakot, eventually the economy collapses.
And Cecilia, because one thought experiment I always do is this. Okay, for a moment, let's just put Aquinos and Democrats and reformists all aside. Let's just compare Marcos' martial law with other similar situations, right? So I always say, in Malaysia, they had Mahathir who had 20 years of semi-dictatorship, right? Lee Kuan Yew had a little bit longer than that, right? Park Chung-hee in South Korea, shorter than Marcos a little bit, but definitely martial law and dictatorship. Then you had the Kuomintang in Taiwan. I always say this, like in the case of Kuomintang, well, look at Taiwan today. A lot of economic achievements they're enjoying today, the foundations of that was built by the Kuomintang era. I'm not saying that justifies the martial law. I'm just saying their economic record is not as bad as their human rights record. In Korea, we know very well that chaebols went from oligarchs like ours, and they were forced to become export-oriented industrial giants that they are today, right? Samsung, LG, a lot of these started, they were just like oligarchs, hacienderos, like what we had back in the days in 1950s, right? Then in Singapore, well, Singapore is really just a city-state, but Lee Kuan Yew didn't do too bad in dealing with corruption and very meritocratic bureaucracy. And in Malaysia, well, they have Proton, a certain degree of economic development, though of course their population is smaller, they have oil resources and all. But granted all of that, even compared to Suharto, I would argue that Marcos' economic record is a complete catastrophe, right? I mean, he's an embarrassment to Asian dictators, right? I mean, Deng Xiaoping and Chinese will be embarrassed to be compared to someone like Marcos. But compared to Latin America, kamusta naman siya? Because some would argue maybe we're not really an Asian country, because I always joke, I feel more at home in Mexico than in Malaysia, right? Like, it's easier for me to blend in Mexico, Ciudad Juarez, than let's say in Sarawak, right? So maybe let's compare Marcos. Let's give a guy a chance. Let's say, okay, maybe you're an embarrassment if I compare you to Park Chung-hee, but what about if I compare you to Brazil or Argentina or Pinochet in Chile? How does Marcos fare?
It's a very good question. I think that, um, well, let's first start with Pinochet in Chile, because I think the
Right.
Pinochet dictatorship gets a lot of credit for economic development, institutional development in
Right.
Chile. But there's a counter argument that even during colonial times, the bureaucratic infrastructure in Chile was better than a lot of other countries.
Right.
And now we've seen huge protests in Chile in the past a year,
Mm-hmm.
uh, showing that, even this transition out of the Pinochet era, the new constitution left so many benefits for the generals that the people are sick of it, and a lot of the revenue from copper, which is a big source of Chilean exports, is not being enjoyed by the people.
Mm-hmm.
So we also see the institutional drawbacks.
So are you saying
Argentina,
Chile, I'm sorry, are you saying Pinochet did well because they had already pre-existing strong state institutions? And I think a lot of Germans, I see a lot of German names in Chile in their elite,
mhm,
in the military and all of that. Because you can make the same argument also in Asia, right? That Park Chung-hee could do more with Korea, the martial law, because they already had strong state institutions. So it allowed him to discipline the oligarchs. But Marcos was always overseeing a weak state. So maybe I'm making an excuse for Marcos, but to be fair to Marcos, hey, Ilocano kapatid, he was actually overseeing a far weaker state. So his ability to discipline the elite was far weaker. Because I'm just saying the Chile argument is relevant in that sense. Kumaga, it's like your dictator in charge of a Ferrari versus a dictator in charge of a jeepney or something like that, right? So obviously the dictator with Ferrari can run faster, right? Just to
sure,
simplify it, right? Yeah.
sure, you're a dictator that has, kasi it's ability, but it's also will, di
Right.
ba? Meron ba talagang, especially in the late years of the Marcos era, a national project besides uh, uh, cornering all the national industries to make sure they belong in interlocking corporations that at the end of the day funnel all the profits to him.
Right. Or his
Meron bang ibang
cronies,
project?
Coanco, Benedicto, all of these friends
Ah,
that
pero
come in.
yun nga, but it all goes back there. Um, Argentina, since the end of the dictatorship, has had multiple currency crises. Um, so medyo magulo din and very personalistic din ang politics doon.
Krishner family, yeah,
The
essentially.
Krishner, uh,
The wife.
every it's I don't really want to get into the details because
Yeah,
it's
no,
like
because I just want, we're not pretending to be experts in like comparative policy of these countries. I mean, I'm just saying this as a kind of a layman level of understanding of other countries comparatively. Kasi ang gusto ko lang maintindihan ng tao dito is that, sige, kung ayaw niyo compare si Marcos sa Aquinos or whatever, at least i-compare natin sa mga similar people in similar era. And for me, the record is not very flattering to Marcos. He didn't do very well, even compared to other dictators. Even in Latin America, you were saying that even the Brazilian generals were not as brutal and perhaps
they're
economic.
not as brutal, and they had a plan for building up national industry, for building up Brazil as the manufacturing base of South America.
Iber, right? I mean, you have there's airline industry, right? There's aircraft, right? Iber, and which the Philippines never had under Marcos. Like, where's our Proton? Where's our Samsung? Where's our that's what I'm saying. What did Marcos leave to us in terms of major industries and all? Aside from utang that forced us to sell even more state-owned enterprises during Ramos and Cory. Like, I keep on saying it. Okay, you don't care about human rights. Well, malaking problema yan. But let's talk about economics. It's not very impressive, my friend, compared even by dictators. He's an embarrassment. So thanks for reminding me that even Brazil did better than him, both on the human rights. Again, sorry, it's really a low base, but by his
It's
own
really low
peers,
bar,
exactly. But by his own peers, right, compared to his own peers, in his own league, he was still a laggard, right? I mean, this is what I'm trying to understand in comparative sense, because that's the only way to properly assess Marcos compared to other dictators or martial law situation. How did he did? But going back to Brazil, because my sense is Brazil has similar problems with us. So kanina, my episode kami ni Mark, we discussed about the disqualification case against Bongbong Marcos, right? For he was not a baby, governor siya, right? Something 1982 to 1985, my tax evasion case, etc. But for some magical, fantastical reasons, he never went to jail or anything. He was just asked to pay a fine, right? Although in any other places, there would be more severe consequences. In Brazil, similar, I would say, to Argentina and even to Chile, it seems ang nangyari also is nung nagkaroon ng democratic transition, it was I think what political scientists call pacted transition, right? So there was a
Right.
deal na we'll give up power, pero wag nyo kami kulong or wag nyo kami ilagay sa preso or something like, wag mo kami patayin or execute. So in a sense, may impunity rin, di ba? May impunity rin sa Brazil. That's a big similarity with the Philippines, the culture of impunity.
It was what we would call a transition from above. Na it was a managed transition, and yung nga, there was the first report of a truth commission about torture came out in when Dilma was president. So what, 2015? I want to say 2016.
Right.
At siya mismo, the ex-president of Brazil, was tortured as well.
Yeah.
But by that time, it was not in the national consciousness. No one was prosecuted. So, and I agree that this absence of national memory is a big reason why we have all this confusion now. We have people calling for dictatorship, for harkening back to dictatorship in both the Philippines and Brazil. Why we have the misinformation that it was only mga komunista that were victims of human rights abuses, which, I mean, even if they were communists, it's not justified. But marami din, wrong place, wrong time lang.
Right.
So
I think that's called the Mang Johnny thesis, right? That's the Enrile thesis, which is whoever got tortured is because comunista sila, there were like treasonous and also kind of he was implying so be it, right?
The self-serving thesis.
Yeah, the Mang Johnny version of history, I always call it, no? So but let me ask again, I don't want to use this jargon because, Mark, you can also come in because I'm also asking you, Mark, bakit sa tingin nyo hindi nagkaroon ng accountability? Again, of course, you can make the institutional argument, mahina yung judicial institutions natin all, but is there also an element of culture? Again, I know we hate to use the culture argument. I think it's very Orientalist and all, but don't you think that culture may also explain it a little bit? I mean, Lee Kuan Yew said something, not that I agree with him. He said, the problem with Filipinos is that it has a soft culture, like they don't hold, like only in the Philippines will they like re-elect someone who pillaged the country to be, their hero or something like that. I mean, you hear those arguments even from other dictators or other authoritarian leaders. Now, there's something soft with our Latin, Iberian, Hispanic culture.
Catholic confession.
Yeah, like let be and let be and let move on and whatever. Do you think there's also an aspect of that? For a moment, just put aside the political science disparagement of these kinds of arguments, because part of me feels maybe it makes sense to a certain degree. But we're not very gung-ho on accountability. We just want to have peace and transition and just basta wag na tayo mag-away. We're non-confrontational. We want to just move forward. Wag na tayo mag-away, wag tayo magulo. You think there's also an aspect of that, perhaps, to a certain degree? Lack of outrage, lack of this sense of justice, resentment that we have to do something about it. I'm not saying we should be like the French or Russians of, killing the Tsars and Bourbons, but why are we like this? I mean, from your understanding, is it something about our culture also?
Ako ba? Sorry.
Mark, ikaw anong tingin mo? Aside from
sa akin, for me, ito namang the whole Marcos revival, ito nangyayari ngayon. Sa akin, it happened during Duterte's time lang naman. Kasi if I remember then, during PNoy's time, Arroyo's time, it was still always the Aquinos over the Marcoses. The Marcoses were shunned, di ba? The dictatorship, pangit, always had parang bad rap sa schools, sa TV. I think yung weaponization ng social media allowed the Marcoses to get back and to get para malagpasan yung dating vanguards, yung dating like the mainstream media and yung mga institutions, the church. So social media allowed them to find a way na mabaliktad yung narrative and mabaliktad yung story. Pero in the last 30 years after people power naman, the Marcoses were always shunned naman, di ba? People were parang nakatago na if you're a loyalist, you're always supposed to be parang quiet lang, or in the last 5 years, they all came out na. They all started na.
So you think Duterte was kind of the bridge that opened essentially the path for all these pro-Marcos martial law golden age to just come out? So if
Kasi,
Duterte didn't win, you don't think it would have been the floodgate that we see today?
yeah, kasi lalo
Right.
pa, they shared a common enemy. Diba?
Right.
Which is yung Liberal Party and all that. So lahat ng
Right.
like diba, parang sinasabi nga everything was the fault of the Aquinos, pero GMA was in power for 10 years and all that. So talagang na-paint ng ganun and that allowed the Marcoses pa to get this revival they're experiencing now. Pero I still remember before 2016 naman na kaya nga nanalo si PNoy kasi
Right.
Filipinos were really proud sa people power and lahat ng nangyari doon at that time. So yun, for me, ganun naman. Talagang itong sa social media lang talaga really change.
So it's essentially the Maria Ressa kind of argument, right? It's like the floodgate got open thanks to the weaponization of social media. Ikaw, Cecilia, what is your take on this? Because again, I'll let me sound very amateur because I look at major political upheavals in the Northern Hemisphere. Give me all the major ones: Russian, French, Iranian, Romanian. I can go on, right? Chinese even, right? And to a certain even. It didn't end up well for those who were taken out of power, right? Like, good luck with Tokugawa, right? Even in Japan, right? I mean, Park Chung-hee's daughter didn't do very well. You know, she kind of made the comeback, but eventually, well, she ended up in jail. In Russia, the Tsars didn't end up very well. In the French case, in the Iranian Revolution, the Shah didn't end up well. But if you look at here in the Southern Hemisphere, in Brazil, in Philippines, etc., like no accountability, like regime change, but the Ancien regime, they're left there to do what you call, and of course Walden Bello has also called in his work, counter-revolution, right? So there's so much room for counter-revolution in this country, right? Assuming the 1986 was really a revolution. Parang tinalo mo tapos iniwan mo lang dyan. Because I remember Waldo Emerson said something very important. If you strike the king, make sure you kill the king. Because if the king survives and comes back, lakot ka, right? In this case, it's like people just struck the king and then left the king, even brought him to the hospital to make sure he's okay, and then took care of his children, etc. And then now you're surprised they're coming back. I mean, like, this is for me lang. I mean, I'm just looking at the Northern Hemisphere, Romania, Iran, Russia, etc. Ancien regime, they were brutal to them, right? And not in it's like in Latin America, Philippines, that's not the case. I mean, I'm not saying we should be like that. I'm just saying, what is the explanation here? How do you make sense out of that? Aside
I
from
think when you said, can we even call it a revolution, yun talaga yung key.
Yeah.
Because all the ones you mentioned from the global north, not the global north, but from the northern hemisphere,
Right.
we're in a different epoca when it was really a
Right.
social revolution, talagang upheaval ng lahat. Yung sa atin
So may
was a
revolve,
change
may revolution because it means you revolve it, right? Like the tire changes, right? So you're saying that didn't happen in 1986. It was not really a revolution. It was just a civilian Bacchus, as some historians put it.
It was a regime change, type change, but it was the beginning of a transition period. All the third wave democracies have all struggled kasi
Right.
when you go from an authoritarian system to and you introduce elections, tapos you have paonti-onti mga reforms about how things actually work on the ground. There's always who was in power is still in power in the not in the presidential palace but in the provinces. Marami pa rin sila nandun. You had to make pacts with people from who left the military, so in really nandun pa rin.
Ramos became the president later on, right?
One of the president, sila Lusutan, sila Ongpin, nandun pa rin. 'Di ba? Saan ng mga oligarchs, saan galing mga oligarchs, ganun pa. Oo. So, I think it's really a sign. There was I'm not sure if it was Fukuyama who we've discussed at length, but there comes a time in world history where democracy is the name of the game, so to speak, where if you have a lot of countries who, especially in the global south, who are not big powerful countries, when they transition, they're expected to sort of play by rules of formal democracy in order to be able to benefit from things like WTO, aid, beneficial trade status. At the same time, the Western countries who are imposing these baselines are interested in democracy in name.
Right.
Tapos there's a delay for them to catch up to what is democracy in quality. So about your question, is it a cultural thing? I'm not sure. On the one hand, you have this argument that it's like the Catholic, I forgive you now and your sins are absolved. But on the other hand, you also have this Latin, Filipino, very macho, I will take revenge, no? I bet if you were to survey people and say, oh, this person uh, uh, my partner cheated on me, do I have the right to kill the other person? 80% will say, oh naman, lalaki ka naman, di ba?
Medyo Juan Luna tayo dun. No, but I mean, the reason I said, look at Spain, General Franco, right? He, not long ago, he had this glamorous cemetery, etc., right? He was, I mean, look at the Francoistas in España, right? I mean, very much like Marcoismo, right? I mean, very similar. I could see that in Spain, for instance. They also have this kind of a let go and let be kind of culture, and not only now they're trying to have a reckoning with it under more progressive kind of government or something.
Yeah, a few years ago they took down the Franco statue because they said this is not a good representation of our history.
Right. Going back again to this issue, so you're saying what happened is hindi talaga tayo nagkaroon ng tunay na revolution kung saan talaga magkaroon ng structural transformation of our society, right? And going back to this, because you know, one of the arguments we discuss in grad school with political scientists and all is, you know, from 1996 and 1997, for a period, Cory Aquino had absolute powers, you know, because there was a suspension of the regime, right? Wala na Marcos eh. At hindi pa na-promulgate yung 1987 Constitution. So some people would argue in that period, Cory Aquino had so much room for radical reforms. Land reform, including in Hacienda Luisita, which is a topic that keeps on popping up, no? And we discussed with Lele earlier, with Lord De Vera, among others. We can discuss it again later. So parang may 1 year si Cory to really do something massive, significant, and yet what she chose was kind of a soft landing, which is like, let's just have a pluralistic, happy, like some would say, if she was a little bit more aggressive all the way, right, and really hammered and bludgeoned some of these oligarchs and put some of them in jail, etc., maybe she would have laid down the foundation long term for a more mature democracy like Korea, like Taiwan, some of our more successful third wave, because not all third wave are doing bad. Taiwan is doing very well. I was based there. They're doing fun. They're putting US to shame. They're putting Europe to shame. Korea is a very, very mature democracy in many ways. I would say way ahead of many Western countries. So we have neighbors who also transitioned 1987, 19. They did much better than us. Of course, there's an economic factors, but I want to say that some radical reforms happened after the transition. In the Philippines, it's like, balik lang yung mga pre-Marcos oligarchs, and then the Marcoses were also allowed to come back. So parang kung mga saling pusa, anything goes, and was not done in those crucial years. But of course, someone could say, but Richard, maybe you're overestimating. Cory was not a politician. She was not trained for this, or that this were a complex time. You didn't want to get into war. There was the communists who could take over. There was a Cold War. I know. I mean, but that's where great leadership comes, right? Making those decisive transformation reforms in those critical junctures in our history. And I would say 1986 and 1987 was really a radical moment that could have been changed for really pushing for revolution, because revolution has phases, right? There's first you kick out the king or the old guy, but there's a second phase, right? It could be reign of terror, it could be massive transformation reform. Parang hindi nangyari yan sa Pilipinas eh. Parang more like anarchy lang nangyari, coup d'etats and all until Ramos put it together. I'm just giving my own kind of version of what I feel ay kulang dun sa transition period after Marcos. Kaya nagsiserka tayo, kaya we're kind of back to the future tayo again with the situation we're facing. Ikaw, Cecilia, what is your take on that?
So I'll say two things about that. First, my understanding is that Cory never had the majority of the armed forces on her side.
Civil military.
That's
a good analysis.
So,
very good analysis.
Parang how can you do clean house pag yung majority of the people with guns are not loyal to you?
Right.
Second, you know, it's a really interesting conversation. I've also had this conversation with lots of Brazilians in the wake of what happened with the Workers' Party here and the progressive governments. And, you know, there's always this could have, would have. We would like the government
to have
done more.
Yeah.
Right, like from someone from my position thinking about the PNoy years, we thought that he had a lot of political capital, that he could have transformed stuff. He didn't think he had that much political capital.
Right.
Ganon din sa Workers' Party dito. People express that they wish that the Workers' Party transformed more. But
Right.
people who are really close to President Lula said he didn't think that it was possible given the configuration of ruling coalition local elites. Feeling niya hindi niya kinaya politically. So,
We're just
eh,
tiptoeing.
of
Is that what
course,
you're saying? Just really tiptoeing, get whatever we can get right, because kung medyo we push too much, we might awaken the dragons, right? Like, and then the whole thing will fall apart, right? I mean, is that what you're saying? I mean, I can understand because
I'm
Lula.
saying I think
So
that
you're saying Lula and Aquino's kind of, there's a kind of a parallel there between Party Trabajador and what's happening also in the case of a Liberal Party. This kind of a minimalist reformism or kind of half-baked.
I don't want to say it's reformism. I want to say it's. I mean, I don't want to say it's minimalist, and I don't think it's something necessarily specific to
Right.
the Workers' Party or the Liberal Party. It's something that is very basic in politics. If I push so much that I can't get anything done, if the ideal becomes the enemy of anything,
Right.
that's the calculation that politicians, that social movements, that civil society, that activists, that policymakers are doing all the time. If I push too much, is the system going to collapse around me and push me out?
Mhm. Right.
Especially when you come to power with very tenuous coalitions. So, parang it's hard for me to just, do I personally think and wish that more had been done at that period? Of course. Kinaya ba niya? I don't know.
What more,
It's like,
in your
ikaw,
opinion,
Mark.
what more could they have done? Yung sa Pinoy's time, saang area siya could he have done more? Dun sa mga issues that are close to your heart, that you are fighting for, what could he have done more for progressive causes?
Ikaw rin, Mark, can you also tell us your opinion on this? Anong tingin mong kapos ng mga Aquinos and all? Because, you know, you have been making this argument also throughout some time, no? Na parang may kulang sa quote-unquote yellow camp and all. You think Marte could have also done more? Because I want to take your point on this, because you're kind of in the center too, diba, Mark? You're not anti-yellow, but you're not pro-yellow. So I want to also get your point before we get back to Cecilia. Ikaw, Mark, ano sa tingin mo, could they have done more about the Marcos issue? Or as Cecilia was saying, it's like on the outside, us watching a boxer and saying, but di mo ni-knockout. Yung pala, ubus na yung energy niya. He was trying to just survive the round. And for us, like, go, knockout mo na. Yung pala, if he missed the swing, he's done, right? So he's thinking different from us. From outside, we see the guy having the chance to have a knockout. From inside, the guy is actually, I have no more energy left. If I miss this swing, the guy is going to knock me out. So I'm just trying to survive this round and be thankful I didn't get knocked out. Is this, because Cecilia is saying this is the problem we're saying, may asymmetry of perceptions. Ikaw sa tingin mo, Mark, saan nagkapos yung so-called yellow project in the Philippines? So you were saying on the social media.
In terms of blocking the Marcoses to come back, ganun ba?
In general, right? Bakit sa tingin mo nawala ng gana ang tao sa mga liberal part aside from Duterte propaganda and all of that? Because I don't think Duterte's propaganda would work kung wala rin some basis of frustration.
Pero kasi yung mga yung mga hinihirit na kay Pinoy, lahat naman ng presidente may problema naman eh. I mean, wala namang presidente na walang scandals and all that. They just amplified more yung na parang lahat kasalanan nila Pinoy and kanyang mom, di ba? Pero yun nga, siguro they could have done more in terms of getting back yung wealth, ill-gotten wealth, and yung what more pa ba? So
you mean pressure the Supreme Court? Kasi yung problema, there were times the courts were siding with the Marcoses, right? I mean, the Marcoses got scot-free because the judicial institutions sometimes.
Pero ang ganda nung point ni Cecilia na na after the Marcoses left, naiwan pa rin naman marami sa mga allies nila, they were all just waiting for the right time to come back. At ngayon nga, that's what's happening now. Everyone, lahat ng political families from the north are they are paving the way. They are full force na for the comeback nitong si Bongbong, di ba? So ayun eh. So hindi that's what I'm asking Richard din eh. Kasi when Lenny ngayon, they are saying na we should stop the Marcoses, we should parang if Lenny wins, what could she do? Diba? What can she do to prevent this from happening, or Is there
Yun nga
anything
eh.
they can do?
Like, what are the lessons that Lenny can learn? Because that's my point. If Lenny wants this to work, she has to make sure hindi maulit yung mga kakulangan.
The word they use is mapanagot eh.
Yes,
Mapapanagot yung
accountability. Right.
that's what I have an issue with kasi 6 years ang Liberal Party sa Malacanang, wala namang nanagot.
Right.
Diba? So what can she do differently this time?
So what you don't think yung ginawa nila kay Jinggoy and Supreme Court Justice Corona, you don't
No,
think
I'm talking about the Marcoses. Syempre yung sa corruption issue. Ako nung sa panahon ni Pinoy, I like yung sa BIR, yung si Lakim Henares, that they became really strict with the taxes. So yun, I really felt that.
Tax collection,
yeah, naramdaman ko. So okay din yun kasi pero yung in terms of the Marcoses, kasi yun yung nagiging issue pa rin hanggang ngayon eh, lalo na that Bongbong is leading in some of the surveys.
Right.
So,
right.
But
Cecilia Lero, like you made a very good point. Essentially, this situation, the boxer situation, I was saying, right? But nonetheless, do you think there was still some major things that were doable and feasible that they didn't do, and it was lack of political will? Whatever that means, because yung isa pang issue ko is like, what is this political will all of us debate about? Because isn't that the whole Mao Zedong Duterte thing? Basta, kaya natin yan. Like, but I mean, there's so much that political will alone can do, right? It has to work through institutions. It has to have strategy, coherence, vision, etc. But going back to that, what were the instances you think na kulang ang political will? Not only kulang yung alignment of forces, if I am to use that term, right? In terms of enabling or empowering reformist governments to push for some transformational changes.
I agree with Mark na yung legacy of the Marcoses, that was something that if I'm not mistaken, Pinoy himself didn't want to take on because he didn't want it to look like a fight between two families. But we're living with the result of that now na the Marcoses were free to create a lot of fairy tales about themselves and walang institutional na sagot. Something that I was really hoping that there would be an industrial policy na hindi nangyari. So again, the difference between a democratic socialist and a liberal, an economic liberal, knows that it seemed like the idea was just to create a positive business environment for private businesses to flourish. But I would have liked to see more intentional investment in key sectors. And
dun sa poverty alleviation, so you think if there was more activist macroeconomic policy, eventually that would lay down the foundation for more employment creation and poverty alleviation, for instance? And I mean, one thing I understand, Cecilia, is, for instance, economists would say one big problem in the Philippines is utility costs, right? Electricity is so expensive. So when I talk to Japanese investors, they tell me, no, it's not your labor or protests and all of that. That's nonsense. It's really your utility costs are just so high. It's so expensive to produce cars here in Laguna compared to what we do in Thailand and now in Vietnam or even Indonesia. And obviously we have a problem there because, well, some would say oligopolistic in practices in utility sector. So in short, if you want to do a good industrial policy, you also have to have a policy against the oligarchy, right? Or something along that line. And ironically, it's Duterte who's making that argument. I'm not saying he's doing that, but it's Duterte who took up the cudgels for, hey, we have to go against oligarchs and open up the economy, etc. I mean, this is also where populists are good, right? They're very opportunistic. They see those weaknesses and then they present themselves as heroes or false heroes for that matter. And perhaps we can now transition also to the case of Brazil before we end up on the Marcos issue and all, because I know it's almost lunchtime there. But I want to understand, how did you personally experience the almost simultaneous or back-to-back rise of Bolsonaro, Trump, Duterte, Trump, and Bolsonaro? And I would say that Bolsonaro is not the Trump of the tropics; he's the Latino Duterte. But anyways, just for chronological purposes, nauna si Digong eh. So si Trump is Duterte of the West, si Bolsonaro the Latino Duterte. But anyways, yeah, going with that. What was your personal experiences, and then what do you think is driving this whole wave of populism? And do you think it's here to stay? Because Lord de Vera was not as pessimistic, di ba, Mark? Parang si Lord is parang, it's very artist way. This is just the latest impressionist fashion. The next thing will be a new art vogue. Don't worry. Parang medyo may pagkaganon si Lord de Vera eh. But ikaw, Cecilia, should we be really worried about, is populism here to stay? Or is populism going to be like COVID-19 more endemic, or is it going to mutate and get even scarier, if I'm going to use the pandemic parallels here?
I think it's something that we still need to be worried about. And I think because it goes beyond, at the end of the day, it's not just about Duterte, it's about Dutertismo, no? It's
The
not just about
demand. Yeah, the demand.
Bolsonarismo.
Yeah.
Oo. And I think that we are going to need, in addition to yung phenomena of what they are and what they represent, meron din yung problems of the institutional decay that we've lived through in these years that they've been in power, no? So going back to my experience, I remember I was here in Brazil in 2015 doing research.
Research
Tapos
lang. No, go ahead. Go ahead, sorry. Go ahead. Sorry, this is our podcast. We do things like that. But anyways, going back. Doing your research, yes.
Oo. At that time, parang, di ba, Duterte was polling at what, 15%?
Not even. It was like 5 to 8% actually until September.
Oh, parang a blip on the radar, pero nobody took him really seriously.
Pampagulo lang, pampagulo.
Oo, ganun din si Trump doon, di ba? Nobody expected him to win.
Right.
So you have at the same time these three candidates seemingly coming out of nowhere saying crazy pink things.
Right. And as a woman, right? I mean, it's double insult to you. I mean, the misogyny is just shocking. As a man, I'm shocked, but I'm sure a progressive woman like you is double shocked, right?
Oh, so for your listeners to know, Bolsonaro was saying he was a congressman for a long time,
right?
Didn't actually pass any meaningful laws.
Sounds
he was
familiar.
He was a former military, I don't know, captain, lieutenant, something like that.
He dishonorably charged, right? Dishonorably charged.
Oh, dishonorably discharged. Tapos he made a name for himself by saying crazy things in Congress. Sinabi niya sa isang kasama niya doon sa camera, I will not even bother to rape you. Parang ganun.
Kasi pangit ka, something like that. Kasi
something like that.
Something like that. Oh, shoot.
So, nag-joke pa kami noon na, I imagine Cecilia, you, Bolsonaro, Duterte, and Trump. Hahaha. Tapos tumawa kami kasi parang, it's so ludicrous, it's so impossible.
Oh my God! That's what I'm saying. Don't make a joke about Bato and all, man. I'm like, serious. Like, you never know. You never know. It's a bongo, di ba?
I have a question. Di ba kasi when Duterte started out, when he was running, he promised that he will be a leftist president.
Socialist daw siya.
Yeah. So what did you think about him then when he was saying na ganon? Did you believe him? And kasi no, then you saw right through him kaagad na no.
Oh, kasi if we really look at yung record niya sa Davao, meron naman mga progresibong city ordinances, etc. Pero kausapin mo yung mga taga Davao, yung mga taga civil society sa Davao, Duterte had nothing to do with all those ordinances. Napaka hands-off siya. It's because they had good counselors. Tapos si Duterte, wala siyang interest sa policy making.
Anong interest niya?
So you knew at that time that he was just saying that maybe to court votes from the left or
Makabayan block, mga
ganun. Oo,
kasi
diba at that time yung pinaka parang strategist niya was June Evasco, who came from the communist tradition. At saka we know as well that Duterte has a history of working with the Makabayan Bloc, the NPA party in the region. So talaga may people around him na progressive, kaya din there was a section of the Democratic left when he got elected that were really actually hopeful na talagang mawawala yung contractualisasyon, katulad ng sinabi niya.
Diba? Wala nang endo and all of that.
Sabi niya, mawawala yung endo, only to backpedal on that. Diba? Tapos after a few months,
naniniwala ka ba ever about that? I mean, were there moments na parang, it's so crazy, it might work. You know what I'm saying? Parang sa Argo.
Alam mo yung...
May moment ka bang ganon?
My moment and my specific context. I hope na talagang maging kamay na bakal siya sa yung bus situation in Metro Manila.
Oh, right.
pero in fairness kayo na, that's something I like about, have you seen the are you familiar with what happened now sa bus system sa EDSA sa Metro Manila?
Ano yun, Mark? Parang okay na, di ba?
Yeah, they made it kasi I saw it sa South America eh. That's where I first saw it sa video. Yung BRT, yung bus
Yung
rapid.
BRT system.
Yeah, they're doing that here na sa EDSA in fairness. So on that aspect, I think he did good. Na bus
Hindi ba
rapid.
dyan magaling si Duterte sa mga low-hanging fruits, yung mga passport, gawin 10 years, license. You know what I'm saying? Yung mga very low-hanging fruits that actually make an impact. Mautak eh. That's a very good strategy. I mean, I would say Isko is doing that somehow, right? Like, sometimes Isko does yung mga very basics, but it resonates kasi yung mga away na human rights and democracies, which is a bit abstract to average people. Pag sinabi mo, at least wala na yung basura, wala na yung laglag bala. Naalala niyo yung laglag bala, napakalaking issue yan sa panahon ni PNoy, yung Apex Summit and all. All of that stopped, no? So, Duterte is really good in that. Is it the same with Bolsonaro? Is he also like that or sobrang sabog lang talaga siya?
Sabog lang.
Pure sabog. At least with Duterte, it gets it right once in a while, like a broken clock, no? Kasi grabe yung sa Brazil, di ba? I mean, there are charges against him for homicide. I mean, he was protesting against lockdown. That was crazy because Duterte is the strictest lockdown man. This is where he diverged, right? Suddenly,
this is where they
divergence. Yeah.
They diverge also on using socialism as a reference. Of course now, so parang yung early Duterte, socialist ako. Yung late Duterte, ay hindi. Lahat ka komunista.
Military. Yeah.
Bolsonaro was always pro-military, has connections to what are called militias here, which are basically street gangs made out of ex and current police who go around. Basically, yung mga tokang cops, they go around killing people.
Davao Death Squad-ish, parang ganun ba?
Parang ganun, pero much more organized. They have their own organizations na independent, pero connected yung mga families.
Right.
Yung nga, super sabog lang si Bolsonaro, denialist when it comes to COVID. Yeah. Pero bakit? Kasi he's so pro big business, mas naging Trump siya. COVID doesn't exist. It's just a little flu. Sinabi pa niya, due to my athletic history, I will never get sick with it. Akala mo malakas siya.
Diba nag-collapse siya in some speech recently or something like that? Na hospital siya, diba? I mean, what's going on with that guy? He's just I mean, even as a Filipino, I'm shocked to see what's going on in Brazil. It's crazy. But a last point on this, because I know we have talked a lot. I want to beat the record with Lord De Vera. But no, I mean, going back to this, nonetheless, may mga iba rin sa Brazil compared sa Pilipinas because ang daming EJK nangyari sa Pilipinas dito. Could be tens of thousands by some accounts. But we never saw major protests. There's a Brazil. Parating may massive protest, I would say. Not parati, but kasi ito yung sa akin, Cecilia, no? And also Mark, no? I always hear dito sa Pilipinas yung term na EDSA fatigue. And nag-EDSA 1, EDSA 2 na tayo eh. Dapat maayos na lahat, di ba? Parang, wait lang, Brazil, I think they're doing that, right? I mean, there's constant mobilization of the opposition and all. You sent me a video the other week or something like that. Both sides had, I mean, tignan mo sa Pilipinas, neither DDS nor Dilawan had major protest or anything in the past few years. Even Duterte people, saan yung mga major, yung meeting the avance lang nila, malaking crowd. After that, wala. There's no major crowd that came out for Duterte. You tell me, Mark, may nakita ka bang 100,000 lumabas for Duterte? Wala. He cannot mobilize huge numbers.
Ay, bayad ha?
Meron pang jeepney na from LGU pwedeng dalhin, di ba? Tapos nung umulan, wala na daw. But anyways, let's not go to there. I'm talking about 2017, October, but let's not go there. Mababash na naman ako. No, but going back, but in Brazil, the opposition is like exciting, etc. You send me those videos like, oh my God, there, wala pa nga kayong EJK and all, di ba? There was a fear na Bolsonaro will do Duterte style also, go favelas and shoot down right and left and kill people. It didn't happen as bad, right? I don't think you have an EJK problem as bad as the Philippines, right?
Well, let me...
Yeah, tell me about that side because I want to understand where Brazil is quote unquote better than us and what we can learn from Brazil.
Sige, let me first address the issue of EJK tapos bakit nakaroon ng malaking mob dito at wala pa sa Pilipinas. Wala pa, hopeful pa ako.
Nagala si Marcos yan. Wag ka lang muna umuwi ha. Pero you were saying. Ikaw yung dahilan eh.
So, dun sa EJK, historically, my mas deadly talaga yung police sa Brazil kaysa police sa Pilipinas.
Exactly. Yun nga eh.
Police is heavily militarized, and kill poor people, long arms, and kill poor people sa mga favelas, sa mga slum areas, especially yung mga poor black men, wantonly, walang total impunity. So it's
So may
always
race
been
element which wala dito kasi dito lahat tayo Pinoy eh. Doon may race element eh. White si Bolsonaro, 'di ba? Italian pa nga yata siya, 'di ba?
I would also argue na sa Pilipinas meron tayong colorism element, no? Kasi pagpunta ka sa yung mga kaibigan ko doon sa mga communities, sinasabi pa nila nung na-elect si Duterte nagkaroon ng mga EJK na ay para makalis ako sa bahay, dapat hindi ako magsusuot ng tsinelas, dapat nakasapatos ako, dapat nakadamit na sosyal, at dapat nakaluklusa ako kasi pag may team payat at nakatsinelas, patay ako.
Yeah.
So
mananlaban ka bigla, yeah. Yeah.
But
going
that's
back, sorry, I cut you. So you were saying EJK, police, federal, Brasilia, they're better armed and all, but EJK problem doesn't seem to be the same, right?
Parang hindi, nagkaroon ng increase when Bolsonaro took power kasi he was sending this open message na if the police kill, that's good. There's going to be impunity. I'll protect you. Pero wala yung itong organized from the executive a system of quotas and incentives na nagkaroon sa Pilipinas. So we had, kumbaga dito sa Brazil, nagkaroon ng increase. Sa Pilipinas, nagkaroon ng talagang spike kasi may organized incentive system for killing.
Dun sa mobilization,
Dun sa mobilization, talagang first of all, mas malakas talaga yung civil society and progressive forces.
They always say Philippines has the most civil society, blah blah blah, but it doesn't seem so, right? I mean,
has a lot of civil society in the sense na ang galing talaga ng mga civil society workers, ang galing ng mga organizers, pero in terms of talagang reach in the communities, I think mas malakas pa rin sa Brazil. Malakas talaga. That is actually the reason why I came here back in 2015 because I did my PhD dissertation on comparative civil society.
Right.
Kasi you have two countries where talagang malakas, very dynamic, very strong yung civil society.
Bakit? Is it because more labor unionish? Because more industrialization? Because Korea also very strong labor unions. Again, they're more because again, maybe I'm more economist here, but yun ang sense ko eh. Like in countries with stronger industrial base, they tend to have stronger unionization and by extension stronger civil society resistance to authoritarianism. Taiwan, South Korea, Brazil. Philippines, they industrialize. India, they industrialize. Kaya mahina yung civil society resistance to maybe I'm being economistic about this.
No, you're completely you're completely right. I was about to go there right now. Mas malakas yung labor movement sa Brazil, and it's a labor movement that since the 1920s had more structure. Than the one in the Philippines, where until actually one of the big projects of Bolsonaro in the far right was to repeal the law where all formal employees have to have to pay a portion of their sueldo to a union, to an approved union. So until very recently, all the unions were relatively well resourced. So,
Mark, masasabi ka ba kanina?
Tanong lang din ako, sa progressive movement sa Pilipinas, where do you think it stands right now? Kasi ako, I like to watch, like sa US, sila Kyle Kulinski, the Secular Talk and all that, yung progressives nila, like sila Bernie Sanders, AOC. Sa Pilipinas ba, where do you think we are now, and how can the progressive movement grow in the future sa Pilipinas?
I think we're rebuilding sa Pilipinas. I think the last couple of years were lalo with the loss in the 2019 elections, it's really been a period of soul searching, of trying to organize again in the essence of a pandemic, and kaya mahalaga din yung sudden spike in EJKs as opposed to a gradual increase in EJKs. Kasi takot yung tao.
Shock, may shock and awe. My shock and awe factor.
One of the reasons why I left the Philippines in 2017 is because the second half of 2016 through 2017, I was going to funerals every 2 or 3 weeks. di kinaya. How can you organize people like that? They're crying all the time. They're afraid.
Overwhelmed.
So, talagang my shock value, my emotional trauma, no? Eh, so I think it's a time of rebuilding. At saka, an election is a really good focal point for that. Kasi, lalo in recent weeks, parang sawa na yung tao sa yung takot, sawa na yung tao sa kalungkutan, no?
Right.
People want to be hopeful again. And no matter who the candidate they're for, it's nice to see na positive messages in some way or another coming out. Na people want to dream again that it can be better than what we have.
Who are the progressive leaders na you think are the future of the movement in the Philippines? You mentioned earlier si Senator Risa, pero who do you see mga future who would carry the progressive movement dito sa Pilipinas? Who do you see pa?
Or in Brazil also, kung may counterpart, people we have to watch out also in Brazil, because I'm very excited about, you have elections also next year. Interesting, di ba? Next year, both Bolsonaro and Duterte's anointed or not so anointed guys will be up for election, right? So can you give us on that? Because we want to wrap on this part. Medyo hindi naman wild forecast or something like that. Hindi naman fearless. Medyo fearful forecast. Anong fearful forecast mo? And who are the good guys and the scary ones to watch out for? Can you tell us a little bit also about that? Thank you, Cecilia.
Oo. So sa Pilipinas, syempre bias ako kasi may party ako and people that I really trust and work with. So obviously Senator Risa, I think I really love and respect VP Lenny's spokesperson, Attorney Barry Gutierrez. I think he's brilliant. I think when he was in Congress, he did a really great job. He's not running for anything, but I think intellectually he's a real focal point of the movement. Again, biased the congressman I used to work for, Tom Villarin. He's also not running, but he's been publishing lately on his Facebook. Paano niya iniikot yung buong Mindanao at kinakausap niya yung tao.
Yeah, from Mindanao si Tom, di ba? Yeah.
And it's almost cliche na sa kaliwa na palagi sinasabi namin, we have to go back to basics. Pero mukhang back to basics as in ground organizing, talking to people face to face. Pero mukhang after a year and a half of being online all the time, talagang we need to talk to each other face to face.
Balik ka next year after elections. Right? Or we will meet pero sa Malaysia muna tayo, wag kang pumasok sa territory natin, baka manalo sige. Pero fearless forecast mo. Is Bolsonaro gonna lose next year? I mean, what are the chances for opposition? And dito sa Pilipinas, anong gagawin mo pag nanalo si Bongbong? Matatroll na naman ako nito. Yeah, ikaw, Cecilia, can you tell us about that?
Or do you want me to
final
start?
part of our analysis, yeah.
Dito sa Brazil, Bolsonaro is currently polling at, I think, in the 30s or a little less.
25, so, I saw one, right? 25. Yeah,
yes,
25, yeah.
So, he's not going to win.
Yeah.
Mas yung issue now is kasi we're quite sure that Lula, the former president of the PT, is going to run. And he's going to be a very strong candidate. The surveys now are showing na if the elections were today, nanalo siya. But the problem is that, not the problem, but the challenge is that the rest of, kasi polarizing figure din siya, parang katulad na nangyari after in the last years of the Aquino years, nakuha na talagang target everything. Kung dilaw, everything pula here is bad kasi pula yung kulay nila. Everything demonization total. So, pero his chances are good. Mas the challenge is the forces of the right, the big banks especially, yung influential generals, we assume that they're in negotiations now about a consensus candidate, knowing that Bolsonaro will not win. So
yung isko nila, na joke lang, Mark. Sino yung ay Mark, hindi mo nakuha yun. I was like, medyo may patama ko. No, just kidding. No, but so who is their compromise candidate of the right? Because Bolsonaro is a kind of a burned product, sunog na eh.
Wala pang malinaw.
What names are coming out? Who are the people we have to look out for?
someone that really wants and is really putting himself out there is the governor of the state of Sao Paulo, João Doria.
Right, of course.
Doria is like when he first came out, he was like a Trump-like figure because he's
Yes.
this ostentatious millionaire who hosted The Apprentice, the version, the Brazilian version of The Apprentice.
I think I saw him years ago on the New York Times. Yeah. So we have that. Who else on the left aside from Lula? Is there someone else, or is the left and center gonna coalesce around Lula na lang, more or less, given na yan?
It's very likely that the left will coalesce. The other, yung other candidate that ran, the non-PT candidate from the left that ran in 2018 was a guy named Bolos, who's from a party called PSOL, which is another left party, a bit smaller than the PT. But he has a really good relationship with Lula and the Lula core. So I think there's a good
Moro,
chance.
see Sergio Moro. I mean, like the lawyer guy, the justice.
Moro,
Yeah.
So for everybody, Moro was sort of like an independent prosecutor. Government kasi dito may system na yung kumbaga yung Solgen is not is really independent
hindi
from
siya
the president.
appointee lang ng presidente na parang bata.
Tapos si Moro naging parang poster boy siya for a bunch of anti-corruption cases against Lula, for which Lula was absolved eventually. Moro possibly kasi Moro was the symbol of yung mga Bolsonarista na hindi super Bolsonarista pero yung mga ayaw sa PT. So Workers' Party. Pero mukhang it's hard to see where his base is, hindi siya umiikot masyado. At saka he was discredited when there were a lot of leaks that came out in the media na siya tsaka yung team niya, they were like
corners.
tampering with witnesses, etc. So hindi ako masyadong sure sa kanya.
May momentum.
Another name that's coming up is this guy named Luciano Huck, who is the host of like the Eat Bulaga.
Tito Soto! Masaya na si Mark. Ito yung Tito Soto nila sa Brazil. Maganda yan. I like this. Sounds so familiar.
Showbiz pa rin. So, we'll see.
So, may mga bomba-bombang dance mangyari pag maganda siya. Naku. Wala silang Pacquiao figure, yung medyo football player, I don't know, boxer na gusto maging politician, walang
UFC fighter, ganon.
Dami nilang UFC fighter eh. Si Glover Teixeira, matanda na, 42 na. Wala bang ganon sa Brazil?
Na pagka-presidente?
Sports celebrity.
No politician.
Politician.
Wait, by the way, yung VP ba doon, parang Pilipinas or America? Tandem ba or separate? Tandem. So American system sila, which is good. So, sino katandem ni Lula? Sino maging katandem ni Lula?
It's very possible na maging Bolos para ma-cement yung coalition.
Yung isip ko di ba? Parang yun yung unity team ng opposition na yun nangyari. So, dito sa Pilipinas, ikaw, Cecilia, ano ang fearful forecast mo? Because things are not looking so impressive so far. From your perspective, I would say. No? What is your fearful forecast? What will happen before you come back to the country next July? May schedule na ako sa'yo. Weekend ng July, ito yung date na ako sa'yo.
Ayun nga sa...
Ako na sa'yo sa airport. Sige, basta huwag ka umuwi until June, please.
Ayun nga sa Gramsci, pessimism of the intellect, optimism of the will.
Yan. Sige. Pessimism lang muna tayo. Mamaya na yung optimism of the will. After elections, kung natalo talaga yung team mo, doon ka na mag-optimism of the will. Pero first, let's be pessimistic. Anong pessimistic? By the way, no, but what is your fearless forecast? What are your worries and hopes in the coming elections? And I can imagine, of course, maybe Lenny is your most comfortable candidate among viable ones. Of course, you can say Calyodi, etc. But what is your advice to them? Because some of our audiences are, of course, from that side too. Marami tayong ka-Isko na audience. Marami din tayo ka-Lenny audience. Marami tayong hopefully ka-Leody audience. Mga Pacquiao people, we want to bring them in also hopefully. Mga Duterte, wala masyado, no? Wala masyado nag-troll sa atin, no? So far, so good. Ikaw, Cecilia, what is your advice? What is your fearless forecast?
So, obviously, BBM is the candidate to Bakit? Kasi as we've discussed at length here, years of machinery and disinformation, only pera, hindi pa nahanap lahat ng pera nila sa Luxembourg, Switzerland, etc. So, by the way, many years ago, I met Bongbong I was at some taping of something. I was being auxiliary to a client of mine. So we shook hands. Ang lambot ng kamay niya. You can
Yes.
believe it.
Malambot talaga yan. That's right.
Like that.
Para sa tayo na
Pero
analysis.
yan nagpulot ng isang pinggan sa buhay
I
niya.
know. He hasn't
Anyway.
touched anything in his life, I think. Very good life.
What I would hope to see is na eyes on the prize no sa mga non-BBM candidates, speak about yourselves, hindi talagang mawawala yung yung negative campaigning about the others, pero sana sinasabi namin wag medyo chill tayo sa horizontal violence, focus tayo sa vertical.
Right. That's an interesting.
So
what do you think of Lenny, by the way? What's your take on Lenny? This pink thing. Do you think this rebranding is a good thing? Parang meta ni Zuckerberg? Is this a Zuckerberg moment or something better?
Zuckerberg moment.
Kasi nice Zuckerberg is a meta.
That analogy. Mahirap din, di ba? Kasi nasa bubbles tayo. Parang nung nangyari, I was also waiting to see if she would announce or not. Tapos when she announced, parang, okay, now what? Pero parang may enthusiasm. So hopefully, kasi part of campaigning is also momentum, no? It's momentum of excitement among your activists and your volunteers. So kung may ganyang momentum talaga. At saka chapters were really self-organizing before she announced. I think that the pink thing is more than just a rebranding. Parang it's more than a PR thing. It's also a chance for her to step out of the shadow of the Aquinos, of the Rojases. Kasi she's not the same as them. She doesn't come from their same pedigree. Hindi siya political family. At talagang may sariling
Robredo brands. Yeah.
Not just kasi fair naman that you call it a brand, pero kasi medyo so ako sa yung we just look at politics as marketing and communications. Obviously it's very important, pero bukod dun parang her identity advocacy is the people who work for her are not all parang hindi sila copy paste ng mga Noy people or Mar people.
Right. Barry is not an LP guy. Yeah, of course. Yeah.
So, I'm hopeful that people will see beyond the whatever this manufactured hate they have for Dilaw, and judge on advocacies and actual managerial experience. Kasi it's not easy to run an office with no budget.
Right. Ikaw, Mark, do you have some final questions before we wrap this up?
Okay naman. I'm looking forward pagbalik niya. Kailan ba? July? But don't listen to Richard. Come back anytime.
Questions. Sorry. No, you're welcome to come back. But make sure you're in pink in the... Don't wear black coming back. Wear pink. Masaya ka. Cecilia, do you have any advice for I don't know, for younger generations? Every time you're I'm not that old. But sige, what's your advice for the younger generations and up and coming social scientists, activists, young university students who are like you, Filipina women, smart women, what is your advice to them?
So first thing is, I really hope to see more social scientists in government. Lawyers are great. No problem with lawyers. Some of my best friends are lawyers. But we need policy that's based on actual data gathering and data analysis, and not just legal arguments. So sana we have balance of social scientists and lawyers working together.
Right.
Kasi siguro medyo na-hurt ako personally, di ba? Kasi if you study political science, all of your relatives think, maging lawyer ka.
Right.
Pag sinabing hindi po,
Like a
ano nga,
pre-law only. It's supposed to be pre-law. Yeah.
a political scientist, ano yan? That's not even a real doctor. Tapos you're not even a lawyer, di ba? So, yun, please, let's put data in policy making. First. Second, especially for sa mga younger people, don't get depressed with social media. It's really, really toxic. It's especially politically, it's really toxic. Pero sana we get off our phones sometimes, finish this YouTube video, pero after this, go out, talk to people.
No,
be
this is
involved in
on
your community.
Spotify and up, so you can
Right,
do it while
Spotify din.
jogging.
You can listen to this while you're
Yes,
walking.
this is actually a
Actual
podcast,
community
but
event.
kind of Joe
Oo.
Rogan, we do it on YouTube kasi marami din audience sa YouTube, visual. They want to see how
Okay.
wonderful we look. But actually, this is podcast, so that's why it's long. So we have folks who listen to this while jogging and then saying napagpangit yung podcast daw, but at least they exercised in the meantime. So I'm happy, right? So ikaw, do you have a guru lifestyle advice also? Like, what are the things you learned during pandemic for mental health? Because this is a big issue. I notice it among students, among younger generations. A lot of people are struggling with so much stress, climate change, all of this politics we have. Ikaw, how do you stay fresh? To use the millennial, what is your secret to being fresh? Is it the lighting from umaga, or is it your toothbrush or something? What is it? How do you stay fresh? How can we stay fresh?
Find something you really enjoy and don't feel bad about it.
All right, thank you very much. I wanted to push you more on your dancing and all of that because you're from Brazil.
I was transitioning there, pero wala nang time ata, no?
No, we're open. It's your lunchtime. Kami ni I think we did more than 2 hours with Lord, no? So don't worry, we can go on pa. But yeah, tell us about the dancing. You want to tell us about the dancing before we close? Because this is a podcast, hindi ito usual stuff. Hindi ito webinar, right? It sounded like a webinar, but this is not a webinar. Tell us about your dancing, and is this the way forward? Because Filipinos, we're so good in everything, right? Might as well also, might as well.
So yes, I'm active in the samba dancing scene in the schools, the communities here.
It was Marco, your reaction ni Marco. He's gonna interview you separately mamaya for Models of Manila. But go ahead, yeah.
Yun talaga nagtulong sa akin during the pandemic to have moments of happiness. At saka it's cool kasi people have this shout out quick sa yung Escologist Samba de Manila. I first learned in Manila with the guru Eileen Sison. At saka I really hope na pag everything opens up in Manila, magkaroon sila ng mas bookings kasi magaling talaga sila.
Ayan, Mark, yan ang natin. Vlog natin next. Punta tayo sa mga yan. Naman na this, Mark. Magana tayo. Yeah, you're saying. I like this.
It's really been great as a physical activity, a fun thing to do. At saka a way to explore your body, your femininity. At saka yung culture. Kasi parang when you dance, you learn. Kasi bilang babae, lalo sa Pilipinas, super Catholic, etc.
Right.
You grew up being very ashamed, no? Ilan sa mga atin, even if it's 40 degrees, we still go out with pants, we still go out with long sleeves. Kasi, di ba, may itong kahit 2021, may sinasabi na pag nagbibihis ng a certain way, you're asking for it.
Yeah.
So, so Samba has really been a way to be unapologetic about being feminine, to do it in a place where you feel safe, na may people protecting you, na hindi ka binabastos.
Right.
And to make friends, kasi another thing that I really want to get across is that the Samba schools are places of people who are, it's a popular culture, it's working class, it's not high culture. So it's a way to be involved.
You're pretentious.
To meet people that you wouldn't meet normally at, some alta sociedad thing for expats or at the university.
Right.
And a way to also have a connection to Afro-Brazilian culture, which also gets underrated and underfunded, credited. So, napakasaya. At saka natural sa Pilipino, 'di ba? Kasi mahilig tayo sumayaw, mahilig tayo sa mga drumming, 'di ba? Palagi naalala ko yung mga tribo sa piyesa ng Tondo pag nasa events ako dito.
Right.
That's something I really miss talking about Isko. I used to see him all the time there dun sa piyesa ng Tondo. Hindi niya ako kilala, pero I would see
Ayan,
him.
Mark, eto na. This is your chance. Go. Eto na yung segment mo. Nag-start na yung segment mo. I'm stepping back. Go ahead. Yeah.
No. Sige.
That was tsaka I'm Ilongga, so also Dinagyan.
Ah,
so
you're Ilongga. That's why your Tagalog is like that. I thought it's because you're Brazilian. Sorry, mine is Ilocano, which is not that the best also. But is it a Ilongga Bisaya accent, or is it just her being just New Yorker Brazilian or something? Again, mine is even. I mean, I'm not saying Ilocanos we have it better. I'm just kidding about. Thank you very much for that, Cecilia. That was really something, because for me, I think the concept of life world is very important. Something that we tend to forget among intellectuals and social scientists. At the end of the day, if you want to connect to people, you want to inspire people, you have to understand their life world. And the way to get through that is to understand what are they passionate about. What is their shtick, right? What gets them ticking? And I think dancing, culture, music is something that it's really so visceral to us Filipinos. And this is what I love about my Filipino side, because of course I'm culturally, I have a very diverse background. So my dad's side, they're more the contemplative, intellectual side, kind of the Caspian Sea, Eurasian thing, very different kind of culture, right? It's my Filipino side, it's kind of a, Hispanic, exciting. This is a very different life world. And honestly, during the pandemic, this was the side that kind of saved my sanity, right? Doing my own CrossFit and dancing, enjoying. This is, I think, what we have to discuss as scholars, as academics, as podcasters, etc. Kaya meron tayong Mark. And Mark is already marking your return date to interview you on your dance. Mark, you should see her. She's really fantastic dancer. I'm a very good dancer. Not many people know that, because they might get too impressed with me and they might not. But I don't want to go there. I did some dance, parang mala TikTok, and then someone said, "Richard, you're so Tito." But something like that. Ayoko na mag-TikTok. But anyways, right, we can discuss about that again later. Thank you so much, Cecilia. Mark, do you have any other question about
Thank
dancing?
you very much.
In fairness, Isko, magaling si Isko rin yung mga moves niya. So looking forward, Cecilia, if you come back earlier, hopefully, maybe you can join the Isko or Lenny dancing or whatever. I don't think I'm going to see on the Marcos kind of campaigns, but at least on the other side, please feel free to join us. Thank you so much, Dr. Cecilia Lero, right, based in University of Sao Paulo, a political scientist by training, an activist at heart, but really a dancer and a musician and artist, right? And she looks very fresh today because of the lighting effect, and I really feel this is unfair. We should have found a common hour. So I look at myself, I look so warag. And then you two look better. Anyways, this is not about me, but thank you for bothering to answer my questions and all. Thank you so much, Mark. Nandiyan mo naman, Mark, di ba? Laling yung dancing life world, biglang nag-open up, nagising si Mark eh. Mark produces like 7 videos a day. I mean, this guy is insane. I mean, you think I'm prolific in my own thing? This guy is crazy. Mark is crazy. Yung addict din to eh. Hindi in that way, baka maano tayo dyan. Pero Mark is also very, very busy. Mark, also, thank you so much, Mark. Enjoy Cebu. Right? Enjoy Cebu. Send our regards to our friends and all. Oy, baka may magalit sa akin. Have a good time with Yorme, everything. Thank you so much, Cecilia. Have a fresh day. Enjoy your lunch. Thank you for reminding me that it's not New York time. So now I think I improved my zoning calculations. Thank you so much, everyone. This is episode 20, Project Pilipinas. As we promised, it's going to be extensive. It's going to be exciting, even if it's almost midnight dito. Tingnan niyo, hyper pa rin ako. Next, we're going to have scientists, marine scientists to talk about West Philippine Sea. We're going to have troll farm experts from our friends in Harvard. We are hoping to have Autumn Aurelio to discuss also journalism and documentary, among others. So we have more guests to come. So please stay tuned. Support us on Spotify, on podcasts, and of course, watch us on YouTube, on our individual channels, and also Project Pilipinas. Maraming salamat. Thank you very much. Catch up soon.
Bye-bye.